Have you ever pondered what could possibly penetrate the hardened exterior of a solitary, cantankerous, and affluent old man? Could it be the allure of money, the sway of power, or perhaps something entirely different, something stemming from the genuine sincerity of a poor 12-year-old boy navigating the gritty streets of a humble New Orleans neighborhood? The answer, like pieces of a fragmented portrait, will gradually reveal itself as we delve deeper into this poignant tale. New Orleans, late afternoon. The Louisiana sun, a molten orb beginning its descent, cast long, melancholic shadows across the weathered facades of the houses in the impoverished district. The air, thick with the humid breath of the Mississippi, carried the faint scent of frying food and the distant, soulful strains of a blues harmonica. Amidst this tapestry of everyday life, the clear, youthful voice of 12-year-old Marcus echoed through the narrow streets. Evening paper. Get your evening news. Each newspaper Marcus delivered was a small victory, a few precious coins added to the meager earnings that helped his mother make ends meet. He was a small boy for his age, but his eyes held a spark of resilience and an unwavering determination that belied his years. After school, while other children his age were lost in games or laughter, Marcus diligently followed his paper route, his worn satchel slung across his thin shoulder. His route was a familiar path, each house and its inhabitants etched in his memory. But there was one house that always stood out, a silent, imposing presence amidst the more modest dwellings. It was the residence of Mr. Henry, an elderly white man shrouded in an aura of mystery and notorious for his ill temper. The house itself was a relic of a bygone era, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, the garden overgrown with unruly vines that seemed to claw at the decaying grandeur of the structure. Mr. Henry was a legend in the neighborhood, a figure whispered about in hushed tones. His reputation preceded him. A recluse, a curmudgeon who would unleash a torrent of angry words at any child who dared to trespass on his property. The mere sight of him, a gaunt figure with a perpetually scowling face, was enough to send most children scattering. But Marcus was different. Perhaps it was his innate kindness, or maybe just a youthful naivety that shielded him from the fear that gripped the other children. Whatever the reason, Marcus never hesitated to approach Mr. Henry's house. Every day, after completing the rest of his deliveries, he would pause before the wrought iron gates, their once ornate design now twisted with age and neglect. He would carefully place Mr. Henry's newspaper in the designated slot, but his helpfulness didn't end there. He would often take it upon himself to sweep the fallen leaves from the overgrown porch, his small hands wielding the worn broom with surprising efficiency. Sometimes, if his mother had baked a fresh batch of her famous sweet potato cookies, Marcus would carefully wrap a few and leave them on the porch, a silent offering of goodwill. The first time Marcus left the cookies, the heavy, oak front door creaked open, and a voice, raspy and sharp as broken glass, barked out, "What's this? Who put this here?" Mr. Henry stood in the doorway, a formidable figure despite his age. His eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. Marcus, though slightly startled, stood his ground. "Good afternoon, Mr. Henry. My mother baked these cookies, and I thought you might like some." He held out the small, carefully wrapped package. "I don't need charity from anyone. Take your treats and be gone." Mr. Henry's voice was laced with irritation, and he slammed the door shut with a resounding thud that echoed through the quiet street. Most children would have been deterred, would have learned their lesson and avoided the grumpy old man altogether. But Marcus felt a strange pang of sympathy for Mr. Henry. He saw not just anger, but a profound loneliness in the old man's eyes. A few days later, Marcus noticed the small plate he had left on the porch was gone. It was a tiny detail, easily overlooked, but for Marcus, it was a flicker of hope. Perhaps, beneath the gruff exterior, Mr. Henry wasn't entirely immune to kindness. And so, despite the occasional sharp words and dismissive gestures, Marcus persisted. He continued to deliver the newspaper, to sweep the porch, and every now and then, to leave a small offering of his mother's baking. He never lingered, never tried to engage in lengthy conversations. He simply performed his acts of kindness quietly and respectfully. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic between the boy and the old man began to shift. The angry outbursts became less frequent. The sharp words softened around the edges. Sometimes Mr. Henry would simply stand in the doorway as Marcus swept, his gaze fixed on the boy, a silent, unreadable expression on his face. There were no smiles, no friendly banter, but the air of hostility had noticeably dissipated. Then, one ordinary afternoon, as Marcus placed the newspaper on the porch, the heavy door didn't slam shut as usual. Instead, it remained slightly ajar. A moment later, a voice, still raspy but now tinged with a surprising gentleness, whispered, "Boy, thank you." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He turned to see Mr. Henry standing in the doorway, his usually furrowed brow slightly relaxed, a hint of something akin to gratitude in his tired eyes. A wide, genuine smile spread across Marcus's face, illuminating his youthful features. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken connection that had begun to form between the unlikely pair. The grumpy old man and the persistent young boy had taken the first tentative step towards an unexpected friendship. The silence that followed was no longer charged with tension, but rather with a quiet understanding, a shared moment in the otherwise solitary lives of both. The afternoon sun seemed to shine a little brighter on that quiet New Orleans street, hinting at the warmth that was slowly thawing the icy heart of the reclusive Mr. Henry, all thanks to the unwavering kindness of a small boy with a big heart. Life, as it often does, holds unexpected turns, sometimes heralded by the subtlest of signs. For Marcus, that sign arrived in the form of an uncharacteristic stillness surrounding the usually formidable residence of Mr. Henry. The rhythm of Marcus's morning paper route was as familiar to him as the lines on his own small hands. He knew which houses had early risers, which ones preferred their paper tucked just so behind the porch swing, and, most importantly, he knew the routine at Mr. Henry's house. Usually, by the time Marcus arrived, Mr. Henry would have already retrieved his paper. Sometimes, the old man would even be peering out from behind the lace curtains of his living room window, a silent acknowledgement of Marcus's presence. But this particular morning was different. As Marcus approached the familiar wrought iron gates, an unsettling quiet hung in the air. The newspaper from the previous evening lay untouched on the porch, a stark white rectangle against the weathered wood. The front door, usually bolted shut and imposing, stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of the dimly lit interior. A knot of apprehension tightened in Marcus's stomach. This was not like Mr. Henry. "Mr. Henry?" Marcus called out tentatively, his voice barely a whisper in the morning stillness. He waited, listening intently for the familiar gruff reply, the sound of shuffling feet, anything to break the silence. But there was only the chirping of unseen birds in the overgrown garden and the distant hum of traffic from the main street. He pushed the gate open gently and stepped onto the porch, his heart pounding in his chest. Mr. Henry? He called again, louder this time, his voice laced with growing concern. He hesitated at the open door, a sense of foreboding washing over him. It felt wrong to enter uninvited, but the sight of the undelivered paper and the open door screamed that something was amiss. Taking a deep breath, Marcus pushed the door open further and stepped inside. The air in the house was heavy and still, carrying a faint musty odor. "Mr. Henry?" He called out one last time, his voice echoing in the silent rooms. There was no response. A wave of fear washed over him. He knew he had to do something. He turned and ran back out to the street, his small legs pumping as fast as they could. He didn't stop until he reached the familiar porch of Mrs. Sarah, a kind, matronly woman who always had a warm smile and a spare cookie for him. He pounded on her door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Mrs. Sarah opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise at Marcus's frantic state. "Marcus? What is it, child? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's Mr. Henry," Marcus stammered, trying to catch his breath. "His door is open and the newspaper is still outside. He's not answering. I think something bad has happened." Mrs. Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. She knew Mr. Henry kept to himself, but the scenario Marcus described was indeed unusual. "Come in, child, and tell me everything." Marcus recounted what he had seen, his voice trembling slightly. Mrs. Sarah listened intently, her brow furrowed with worry. "You did the right thing coming to me, Marcus," she said, patting his shoulder reassuringly. "I'll call the emergency services right away." Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet morning air. Paramedics rushed into Mr. Henry's house, followed by a couple of concerned neighbors who had been alerted by Mrs. Sarah. Marcus watched from across the street, his heart heavy with anxiety. He saw the paramedics emerge, carefully carrying Mr. Henry on a stretcher, his face pale and still. News of Mr. Henry's sudden illness spread quickly through the small neighborhood. Most people weren't particularly surprised. Mr. Henry had always been a solitary figure, his interactions with others minimal. Yet, a sense of unease settled over the community. Despite his gruffness, he was a fixture on their street, and the sight of him being taken away in an ambulance was a stark reminder of their own mortality. The flashing lights of the ambulance disappeared down the street, carrying Mr. Henry towards the sterile environment of the city hospital. Marcus stood with Mrs. Sarah, watching until the street was quiet once more. A silent question hung in the air. What would become of the grumpy old man who had, in his own peculiar way, become a part of their lives? The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of the hospital corridor, a stark contrast to the familiar smells of his own home and the overgrown garden of Mr. Henry's house. Marcus stood outside a closed door, the number etched in cold, impersonal numerals, his heart filled with a mixture of worry and a strange sense of responsibility. The following day, after finishing his paper route, Marcus approached his mother with a hesitant request. "Mama," he began, fiddling with the strap of his satchel. "Can I go visit Mr. Henry at the hospital?" His mother, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile despite the hardships life had thrown her way, looked at him with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "Mr. Henry? The old man on your route? Why, Marcus, he doesn't have anyone, Mama," Marcus explained, his voice earnest. "The nurse said I was the only one who came to see him yesterday. He looked so alone." His mother's heart softened at his words. She knew Marcus had a kind and compassionate spirit. "All right, baby," she said, ruffling his hair. "But you be careful and don't stay too long. And make sure you thank the nurses for taking care of him." With a grateful smile, Marcus set off for the hospital. The journey felt long, each step fueled by a sense of obligation and a growing concern for the lonely old man. When he arrived, the bustling atmosphere of the hospital was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of Mr. Henry's house. He found the correct room number and stood for a moment outside the door, gathering his courage. He took a deep breath and gently pushed the door open. The room was small and sparsely furnished, dominated by the white hospital bed where Mr. Henry lay, his frail body almost swallowed by the crisp white sheets. Mr. Henry's eyes were closed, his face pale and drawn. An oxygen tube was gently placed beneath his nostrils, and a rhythmic beeping sound emanated from a machine beside his bed. He looked so vulnerable, so unlike the stern, unapproachable figure Marcus knew. A nurse was adjusting the 4-drip beside the bed. She turned as Marcus entered, her expression softening when she recognized him from the previous day. "Hello, young man," she said quietly. "It's good of you to come back." "How is he?" Marcus whispered, his eyes fixed on Mr. Henry's still form. The nurse sighed softly. "He's stable for now. The stroke was severe. He's still unconscious." Marcus felt a pang of sadness. He walked slowly to the bedside and stood there for a moment, just looking at the old man. He couldn't imagine being so alone, so vulnerable. A sudden wave of empathy washed over him. Despite Mr. Henry's gruffness, he was a human being, and right now he needed someone. He reached out a small hand and gently placed it on Mr. Henry's frail, bony hand. It felt cold and lifeless. "I'll stay here with you, okay?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "I won't leave you alone." As if in response to his words, Mr. Henry's eyelids fluttered slightly. His eyes, clouded and unfocused at first, slowly opened and turned towards Marcus. A flicker of recognition, faint but unmistakable, appeared in their depths. A single tear escaped the corner of his eye and traced a slow path down his wrinkled cheek. He squeezed Marcus's hand weakly, a silent acknowledgement of the boy's presence and his heartfelt promise. In that moment, a profound connection formed between the unlikely pair. A silent vow exchanged in the quiet confines of a hospital room. A promise of companionship in the face of profound loneliness. Time, a relentless yet often gentle healer, continued its steady march. Weeks turned into a couple of months, and slowly, miraculously, Mr. Henry began to recover. The frail grip on Marcus's hand grew stronger, the faint whispers turned into clearer sentences, and the light in his eyes, once dim and distant, flickered back to life. One sunny afternoon, a message arrived from Marcus. Mr. Henry wanted to see him. A nervous excitement bubbled within Marcus as he approached the familiar, yet now somehow different, house. The overgrown garden seemed a little less menacing, the peeling paint a little less stark. He knocked gently on the heavy oak door, and this time, it was Mr. Henry himself who opened it, leaning slightly on a cane but with a genuine, albeit still somewhat reserved, smile gracing his lips. "Come in, Marcus," he said, his voice still a little raspy but much stronger than before. "Come in, my boy." Marcus stepped inside, and his breath caught in his throat. The interior of the house was nothing like he had imagined. Gone was the dusty, neglected atmosphere he had briefly glimpsed through the open door. Instead, He found himself in a meticulously kept space filled with antique furniture, gleaming silverware displayed in glass cabinets, and walls adorned with framed photographs. But it was one wall in particular that drew his attention. It was covered floor to ceiling with portraits of a distinguished-looking man, a man with a sharp, intelligent gaze and an air of undeniable authority. And then it clicked. It was Mr. Henry, but a much younger, more powerful version of him. Mr. Henry followed Marcus's gaze and sighed, a hint of melancholy in his eyes. He gestured towards a plush armchair. "Sit down, Marcus. There are things I need to tell you." Marcus settled into the chair, his eyes still darting around the room, trying to reconcile the image of the grumpy recluse with the powerful figure in the photographs. "You're wondering about all this, aren't you?" Mr. Henry said, his voice soft. "Well, in my younger days I was a wealthy and influential official. I had power, money, everything the world deems important." He paused, a shadow passing over his face. "But as it often happens, those things, they can blind you. I became consumed by my work, by the pursuit of more. I neglected my family, my wife, my children. I was always too busy, always chasing the next deal, the next promotion." His voice grew heavy with regret. "In the end, my ambition cost me everything that truly mattered. My wife passed away and my children. They grew up feeling abandoned. Eventually, they left. They wanted nothing to do with the cold, distant man I had become." Marcus listened intently, his heart aching for the old man. He had never imagined such a story behind the gruff exterior. Mr. Henry took a shaky breath. "For years, I lived in this big house, surrounded by my possessions, but utterly alone. The money, the power, they meant nothing in the face of that emptiness. I became bitter, angry at the world, pushing everyone away. That's why I was so unpleasant to everyone, including you, Marcus." He looked at Marcus, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "But you, my boy, you didn't give up on me. Despite my rudeness, you kept coming back, offering your kindness, your help, those delicious cookies your mother makes." A faint smile touched his lips. "And in those last few weeks in the hospital, lying there helpless, facing the possibility of never leaving that bed, I realized what truly matters. It's not the money, not the power. It's the genuine connection, the simple act of human kindness that you showed me." He reached out and placed a hand on Marcus's arm, his grip surprisingly firm. "You showed me that there is still good in the world, Marcus. You reminded me what it means to be human." Mr. Henry's confession painted a vivid picture of a life lived in pursuit of worldly success at the expense of personal connection. His isolation in his later years was a direct consequence of those choices. Marcus's unwavering kindness had acted as a catalyst, forcing Mr. Henry to confront his past and recognize the true value of human sincerity. The opulent house, once a symbol of his success, now stood as a testament to his loneliness, a loneliness that only a poor boy's genuine compassion had begun to alleviate. Several months passed, and the bond between Marcus and Mr. Henry deepened. They spent hours talking, Mr. Henry sharing stories of his past, Marcus recounting his daily life and dreams. Then, one quiet evening, Mr. Henry passed away peacefully in his sleep. The news of his death rippled through the neighborhood, met with a quiet sense of closure. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. A few weeks later, a lawyer arrived at Mr. Henry's house to read the will. To the astonishment of everyone in the neighborhood, The lawyer announced that Marcus was the sole heir to Mr. Henry's entire estate. The news spread like wildfire. Whispers of disbelief and shock echoed through the streets. A poor boy inheriting a fortune from the grumpy old recluse? It seemed like something out of a fairy tale. But Marcus remained unchanged. The newfound wealth didn't alter his humble nature or his kind heart. After careful consideration and with the guidance of his mother and the lawyer, Marcus decided what to do with the inheritance. He remembered Mr. Henry's words about the importance of genuine connection and the emptiness of a life lived solely for material gain. And he remembered the joy he felt whenever he lost himself in the pages of a library book, a luxury many children in his neighborhood couldn't afford. Using the inheritance, Marcus established a foundation and built a free library for the children of the poor neighborhood. It was a bright, welcoming space filled with books, computers, and comfortable reading nooks. He named it the Henry and Marcus Library, a lasting tribute to the unlikely friendship that had changed both their lives. And every day, without fail, Marcus continued his old routine. He would bake a plate of his mother's sweet potato cookies and place them on the porch of the house that now belonged to him, a silent and heartfelt remembrance of his grumpy, lonely friend who had, in the end, shown him the true meaning of kindness. The story serves as a poignant reminder that true wealth lies not in the abundance of possessions, but in the richness of human connection and the sincerity of a giving heart. The tale of the poor boy and the grumpy old man has reached its conclusion, but the echoes of their unlikely friendship and the profound impact of simple kindness linger in our hearts. If you found this story moving and meaningful, please consider sharing it with others. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and thought-provoking narratives. We look forward to sharing our next story with you soon.